Hello, everybody, and welcome to RBCM at Outside. It is September 30th, Wednesday. My name is Liz Crocker, and I'm a learning program developer at the Royal BC Museum, and I host this regular webinar. And we record these programs, so this will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel later. But welcome if you've never been before. If you miss any of the episodes, you can go to YouTube and you can watch them. So right now, I'm downtown Victoria on Vancouver Island and right outside of Fantan Alley. And I'm going to get to my special guest here in just a few minutes, but just a few things before we get started. First of all, second of all, I guess, because I've already introduced myself, but I want to acknowledge that we are on the territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations in Victoria. These people are also known as the Lekwungen-speaking people. And I apologize if it sounds like I'm yelling because it's very loud. It's very, very loud. There's buses and people everywhere. This is the fun of the live outside program. You never know what's going to happen. So I'm also wearing my orange shirt today. I'm going to back up so you can see it. So it's Orange Shirt Day, September 30th. And today, my colleague Chris O'Connor, who's actually in the Zoom room helping me out here today, he did an RBCM at-home kids program with the organizers of the Victoria Orange Shirt Day event. And so I recommend, if you didn't get to see it, go see the recording if you want to learn something more about the Orange Shirt movement, which is about to recognize survivors of residential schools and those children that lost their lives in residential schools. And also, if you want to learn a little bit more about residential schools through the resources at the Royal BC Museum, we have content on the learning portal about residential schools, and Chris will put a link up to there. There's even, if there's any teachers or educators in the room out there, there's some lesson plans as well on that. All right, so for the format for the program, it's webinar format. I can't see or hear you. Hopefully you're seeing and hearing everything okay. But you can interact through the chat and we will be able to answer some questions. We can answer a couple as we're going along, and but we'll save time at the end. So please type in your questions. And right, the next RBCM at Outside is in 2 weeks on October 14th. And it's going to be at Point Ellis House. We were going to do that one 2 weeks ago, but we couldn't do it because of the smoke was so bad here. It was not safe for us to be out. So join me in a couple of weeks to go to Point Ellis House and learn about that fascinating historic site. But today, without further ado, I am here with, in the Zoom room, Dr. Tzu-I Chung, who is our curator of history at the Royal BC Museum. So she's going to be listening in and conversing with me and John Adams, my guest that I have here outside with me. So we're going to social distance, and I'm going to flip the camera around in a minute and give John the mic, and we're going to follow him. So John Adams, if you're not from here, if you're from Victoria, you probably are aware of him. He's kind of a local, a famous guy. Everybody knows, if you know history, you know John Adams. He's a local historian, and he has a company called Discover the Past, where they do really, really amazing walking tours. And he is also the secretary to the board of the Victoria Chinatown Museum Society. And John is just steeped in knowledge of this place here, especially Fantan Alley, this historic alley that has this really extraordinary past, which we're gonna learn. I'm gonna stop talking so we can learn more about it. So I'm going to flip the camera and I'm gonna get John. There's John. Now I'm going to take my mic out. Hopefully, so let me say something.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Is that good, Chris?
Yes.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Good.
Fabulous. Take it away, Joe. I'm going to follow you.
Hello, Liz, and everybody out there that I can't see. And we decided to start here because although most people in Victoria know Chinatown, they think of the next street over, which is Fiskard Street. But Chinatown in its heyday was 8 city blocks. And most of the old historic buildings are still here. They just aren't used by Chinese businesses anymore. This is now Pandora Avenue, but they changed the name in the 1960s. It used to be Cormorant Street. This entire block that leads down to the Johnson Street Bridge that way, and it continued all the way up that way for one more block beside City Hall, where Centennial Square is today. But there are no Chinese businesses left on this block. one building only, right here. I don't know if you can see the beautiful sign that was put in just last year. That tells us that this is the Hoi Sun Ming Young Benevolent Association, one of the many clan associations and district. This is a district association, but there were clan associations as well for the young men who came here a long time ago from Guangdong. But that's the only building left on the street that is still in Chinese ownership. They renovated it 4 years ago. Alan Lowe, our former mayor and architect, did the work. Now rented out, apartments upstairs and shops below. But as we walk through Fantan Alley, which is right here, there's not a single Chinese business, at least the businesses we think of as Chinese. There are lots of interesting businesses, but we'll see how the transformation has taken place. But between this street, it was built up before the railway era, early 1880s, and Fiskard Street that developed after the railway era. There are many connecting passageways. The most famous one of all is right here. And there's a sign, brand new sign, over the entrance. It's in red and it says, peering into the past. And oh, we'll watch for the bikes that are zipping down the bike lane here. And peering into the past is the name of an exhibit that was put in just a month or so ago. I'm going to cross first, but Liz is going to take her time because, oh, there is a bike coming. And we'll have a chance to see that exhibit a little bit later on. So there is the sign, peering into the past. It's always a fascinating place to come, but there's probably a little bit more reason to entice people into the alley these days. So narrow, and social distancing is always difficult anyway in Fantan Alley. So I'm going to walk in, and as we go in, I should mention that, just make sure that nobody else is coming this way. The advantage of a Wednesday at the end of September, it is a little quieter. Fantan. So strange name, perhaps, if you don't speak Chinese. Fantan is a Chinese gambling game. Probably the most popular gambling game for the young men who came here from Guangdong 150 years ago. It's hardly played at all in China these days. Most young people in China never heard of it before. They might have seen it in costume dramas that they see on TV all the time. Anyway, I'm going to walk through this way, and if I go backwards, I'll probably bump into somebody, so I'm going to turn around. Looks as though it's safe right now. Of course, gambling was not legal, still isn't in Canada. And in the heyday of this place, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, it definitely wasn't legal, but the police would raid these places. And that's why the entranceway is so narrow, so that when the police decided to come, they could only come in single file.
That's new.
So we're actually just going to have a quick look at this. This is a new exhibit put in by the Victoria Chinatown Museum Society in cooperation with the Royal BC Museum. This is a live video for the Royal BC Museum. So come on down and have a look if you'd like. Oh, okay, so if you're not supposed to be here, be at the back of the camera. So we are going to come back here and have a more detailed look with Tzu-I a little bit later on. But this is the feature window exhibit featuring the Freemasons lantern. But there's something else here that sometimes people don't notice. That's what I'm going to point out right now. Just climb up here on this very handy bench. This is a fire insurance map. And there were lots of them. The fire insurers needed to know what the buildings were made of, what they were used for. There was a restaurant in a wooden building. For a fire insurer, that was not so good. The risk was higher. If it was a store in a brick building, that was probably a little bit safer. So here we have Cormorant Street, the street we just left, which is that way, now called Pandora Avenue, just to confuse us. Buildings along here, the ones we saw, the Hoi Sun Ming Young Benevolent Association is this one right here, built in the 1880s. They changed the name to from Cormorant Street to Pandora Avenue in the 1960s. And here we are. We've just walked down the narrow passageway, Fantan Alley. And the business right here used to be called Tzu-I Chung. It was one of the largest opium manufacturers. You can see this little indication up here says opium factory. It stood just over there. There were 13 of them in Victoria up until 1908. But later on, this space where we are right now was operated by the Chung Wo Company Groceries. They ran a taxi service and they had a little gambling table at the back, probably almost exactly where we're standing. And the person who now owns this building has decided to rename this little place Chung Wo Passage. But as we go through Fantan Alley, it gets narrow at the other end. We emerge onto Fiskard Street. We're going to have a very quick look at that and the Chinese Freemasons Hall that is there. They were the ones for whom the lantern and the exhibit was made. But let's have a look at that later on, and we'll come back here and head back up the stairs. Fantan Alley was a very lively place, day and night. There were at least six gambling rooms upstairs, mini casinos. They weren't huge, maybe the size of a small living room and dining room combined, usually with one way in and one way out. They were upstairs, not in secret passages underneath. That's one of the persisting myths in Victoria. There are no secret passages. It's solid rock under there. The gamblers were upstairs because they knew that if the police did arrive with axes and sledgehammers to bash down the doors, they could escape out the back windows. If they were in tunnels underneath, there was no escape. We know the names of many of these places. The one right here, there's a wonderful shop. It's called the Umbrellatorium. And upstairs, there are arched windows with recessed balconies. That's one of the hallmarks of Chinatown here and in many other cities. In Guangdong, in Macau, in Hong Kong, there are recessed balconies just like that. They copied the style here. But for years, that building was derelict, and those recessed balconies were completely covered over. Nobody knew they were there until a few years ago, they decided to renovate the building. And beautiful spaces looking down over the alley. But when that was the Sai Li gambling room in the early 1920s, one of the newspaper accounts tells us that those balconies actually had a very useful purpose, because as the police headed up the stairs, the gamblers were shinnying down ropes right here from the balconies into the place where we're standing in the alley. That was just one of the gambling dens, Sai Li, and it existed right through the 1950s, perhaps the early 1960s. But the next place along, right here, upstairs, Daigun, or Daguan, the big club. And the sign for that was there until just a few years ago. It's gone now. I had a chance when I was a student back in the early 1970s, student at UBC, to go upstairs to the gambling club that was just closed a year or two before. It was the last one. And there was a door, a very thick door, about 2 or 3 inches thick, with a peephole, with a bar controlling the access. And only the people that were really privileged to be up there, the ones that were safe, i.e. not the police. The bar was pulled up and the door opened, but slammed shut behind you. That door, unfortunately, is also gone. The Hoi Sun Ning Young Benevolent Association now uses this space, because they own this building as well, as part of their current meeting room. Of course, back in 1971, when I went up to that gambling room at Dagun, did I have a camera? Who had a camera in those days? Certainly not on our phones. And all the stuff was there. It was simply left, and as far as I know, was thrown out. Nobody ever recorded or collected any of it. However, just here, a gate closed. This leads into the place where one of the last remaining opium factories was in Victoria. To 1908, the Canadian government banned opium. Gambling was not legal, but opium was legal. And the Shan Yun factory was just back there, a wooden building. The concrete pad that it stood on is still there. And the owner of this space thinks maybe it should be called Shan Yun Court, just because of that. But if we could go through there, we would see the backs of the buildings and the places, the hidey holes, where perhaps some of the gamblers decided to take refuge when the police were on their way. And no shortage of gambling dens. This one is Xin Shujia, the New World. And it was also in operation for many, many years. Now it's being renovated right now as we speak into accommodation upstairs. But lovely shops below. But all of these places closed up as the gamblers left. Chinese were leaving Chinatown, moving into the inner suburbs and then later the outer suburbs. Well, these places simply closed, and there were gates placed at the end of the alley. Nobody was allowed in for years through the 1970s, until finally people said, you know, this place has character. And Dr. David lied. The University of Victoria in the geography department said, yes, it does have character, but you know, the Chinese aren't going to come back to repopulate these places, but why don't we bring in artists and students, young people that might like the bohemian, funky lifestyle? And that's really well what happened. And it's going now through another process of renovations. The place upstairs is one of the ones that is being renovated right now. And here's another name, a gambling club upstairs now, beautifully renovated studio for one of Victoria's well-known designers, J.C. Scott, who has been associated with Pantan Alley. He's worked here and lived here for many, many years. So the gambling dens are gone now. And after a hiatus of 10 years, it opened up as a place for shopping, browsing, lots of interesting boutiques, lots of interesting places upstairs, including a few of the original artists' studios that were created in the 1970s. There's one right up there. We maybe can't see it so well, but it's a beautiful spot right up at the top, a place that used to be, of course, guess what? A gambling den. And I know the daughter of the family who once ran that place. And there's a stairway here that looks very, very exotic and very intriguing. It simply leads to one of the places upstairs, the Fuliguan gambling den. But the egress from the other gambling den I showed you is here, hidden behind this metal wall. There's a stairway that leads up that way. And when the police decided to raid that place, which they did occasionally, the gamblers were piling out the back and heading into the alley that way. But from what I'm told by many of the old timers who ran these places, and I've had a chance to interview many of them unfortunately now passed on. Well, even though the police did occasionally put on a show and raid these places, the bribes kept them out most of the time.
John and Liz, there's just a question that has come up from Linda, who asks, what kind of shops were at street level?
In Pantan Alley, there were several restaurants, and mostly restaurants. Over the years, things changed a great deal, but latterly it was mostly restaurants. In the rest of Chinatown, we have now just emerged from Pantan Alley onto Fiskard Street, and there was a wide range of businesses here. This is where most of the Chinese-run businesses are. We'll see food shops, we'll see shops that might be called curio shops. They sell pottery, china, and so on. There were restaurants, of course, but there were restaurants that served every taste. There were clubs upstairs, but at the lower level, there were shops. And well, just to name a few from over there, there was the On Hing Cigar Factory. The On Hing also ran a general store and a gambling place. Several restaurants over here. The oldest one, I should point out, is, if you can just focus on that white van, Liz, and then to the right of it, there's a lovely red umbrella. And it's a little tiny place. The front of the place is painted red. It's a shop that has been in that building since 1889. That building is the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, built in the mid-1880s, and Hoi Sing, the butcher shop, has been there almost from the beginning. It's the oldest continuously operating Chinese business on the continent. And so there were many different businesses. Today, the number of businesses and the variety is much reduced. But before we turn around and go back into Pantan Alley, there's one place we have to have a look at, because remember that lantern that we talked about, the Chinese Freemasons lantern? Well, just here, in a building that is very old, but it's been modernized 30 or 40 years ago, on the front, you can see the insignia of the Chinese Freemasons, or Tzu-I Chung. They are not linked in any way at all with the Western Freemasons, but they were a secret society, as the Western Freemasons were, and to prove that they were no more dangerous than the Western Freemasons, because everybody thought they were up to no good, well, they adopted the same insignia. It was a good idea. The square and calipers and the G. This is the headquarters for the Chinese Freemasons here in Victoria. And it was for them, many years ago, that that lantern was created. And what I'd like to do now is to head back into Pantan Alley. There's lots more to see out here, but maybe we can do that another time. And as we walk down here, I should mention that Chinatown in its entirety, not just this street, is a National Historic Site. 8 city blocks, some of the oldest buildings dating back to the early 1880s, some of the more recent ones dating, well, there was one built just over there last year. They're all within the Chinatown National Historic Site. So let's find the entrance to Fantan Alley again. If you blink, you'll miss it. It's so narrow. Many people say it's the narrowest street in Canada. I really haven't measured the others, but it's definitely narrow for sure. And as we walk in, you can see another one of those signs that tells us that the new exhibit, Peering into the Past, is to be found down here. So let's walk reasonably quickly. We'll let these folks go through first. We'll follow them and we'll head back to the exhibit. There are many people who have never been to Victoria or to Fantan Alley. But they might remember it because in the movie back in 1990 called Bird on a Wire, everybody asks about this, Bird on a Wire, Mel Gibson, Goldie Hawn. It was supposed to be a Midwestern town in the States, but they came through, they were escaping somebody and they ran down here on a motorcycle and they added a bit more to the alley to create more ambiance, signs and bric-a-brac. And when they got to the other end, they landed in some wet cement. That stopped them. It wasn't wet cement, it was actually a big trough of paper mache. And I brought my kids down here to have a look at the filming, and they had to do many, many takes. It must have been quite a mess when they got into that paper mache. So we're passing all the other places, the ice cream shop, the used record shop, the clothing shops, the soap shops, the umbrella shops, the jewelry shops in Fantan Alley as it is today. But now, back to Chung Wo Passage, or officially, number 3, Fantan Alley, and the Chinese Freemasons lantern. So this is one of the projects that Tzu-I Chung has been very, very involved with, and she was the one that suggested that this be the theme for the new pop-up exhibit, which was jointly sponsored by the RBCM Museum and the Victoria Chinatown Museum Society and the Salient Group, the landlord of this particular space.
Liz, can you move your camera to the upstairs window that John is facing? Up. So these are the oldest children of the Li Monggao family. Li Monggao and Situ Chan, the parents of the family, are really celebrities because their father was the first principal, but also the main fundraiser for the first and continuing Chinese school, which is the Victoria Chinese Public School. That's on Fiscar Street today. And these are the photos of them as children, and their extended families are still around. And John can tell us that their former residence is also around Chinatown. Thank you, Liz. And we chose this image because you can actually see the family on murals in other parts of the Chinatown, which we probably don't have time for Liz and John to walk over. But specifically, this Chinese Freemasons lantern should be featured here because the original is part of our collections, and it's gone through intensive conservation treatment, which won International Plank Award after it was done, but it's still too fragile to be showcased. And therefore, we actually digitized to show people how originally it could be displayed and functioned in a way that involves a lot of moving parts and a lot of art and crafts training in this old master that we heard about, who specifically made this for the Freemason, the Chinese Freemasons, or we say, or we call them Homen in Chinese history, or the Darkling Club, which is a religious group that was established in the early 20th century to protect their integrity and not be incorporated by other political parties. So you can see how when the light and the heat is applied from underneath, all these parts on each of those side panels actually move. And on top of it, there were the Chinese Freemasons icon, and then underneath are the donors. And this is very much linked to the Chinatown history that when it was still part of that community of exclusion era, when people actually really bonded together as a very close-knit community to work together and live together. So some of the elders that we work with have living memories of seeing this in its full display in Chinatown, either at the Lantern Festival or on display upstairs in the Chinese Freemason headquarters that John and Liz just showed the door of. And today they are only remembered by the artifacts in our care, in our collections here that don't have that full glory, but you can see it here in the digitized version. And the same video can be found on the RBCM Museum YouTube channel. And there are a lot of different stories that are that were interviews of people who lived during that time in the 1930s to 1950s to see its full glory. And they are on our learning portal. John, do you have anything to add about the Li Meng Gao family in the area?
Well, Li Meng Gao was probably the most prominent person who had come here from China. And one of the reasons he became so well known was he spoke English fluently and became an interpreter. And he lived here from the early 1880s until 1920. And he was one of the few Chinese men who actually had a wife and family here. And yes, two of the places where they lived are still standing, one on Pandora Avenue, now part of Market Square, and the other one on Fiskard Street. Wasn't one of the places we walked by, but they're still standing. They lived in a couple of other places as well, but they were very, very prominent. All of those kids that you saw in that picture that we saw earlier, did move back to China with their parents, but the kids all returned to Canada, even though it was during the exclusion era, because they had pieces of paper to say they were born in Canada. But they didn't return to Victoria. They moved to Vancouver, and they've now scattered, of course, worldwide. So Li Meng Gao, probably the go-to person in the early days for anyone. A newspaper editor seeing something in Chinatown, they went to Li Meng Gao to find out what was going on. And he was reported a great deal in the newspapers.
And they raised a very large family. And because the early Chinese Canadian communities and Chinese American communities were so gender astute that there were very few women and few families. So all the Chinese Canadian, Chinese American families in the Lower Mainland, on Vancouver Island, and in Washington State were all very interconnected by the clan associations and marriage relationships. So we actually know quite a lot of family members in the Lower Mainland and on the island that are related to the family in some different ways, or belong to the same type of clan associations. So this exhibit in Chinatown has a sister exhibit in the Royal BC Museum in the free public area on the first floor. It's called A Tale of Two Families. It is a juxtaposition of one French Canadian and one Chinese Canadian family who have gone through very, very difficult times of exclusion era, 2 world wars, economic recessions, big and small, over the decades to survive to today. And their stories are quite interesting in terms of how we during COVID time, facing all the challenges, can learn from about resilience. And the Chinese Canadian family featured in the Tale of Two Families exhibit actually is related to the Li family too.
We have a question here from Kim, who asks, during the walk, we saw a sign that said Canada's oldest Chinatown. I thought I recently heard it called the world's oldest. Which one is it?
Well, the world's oldest Chinatowns are probably outside of China in Southeast Asia. Chinese began to leave southern China in huge numbers back in the 1600s and 1700s. And they eventually ended up in North America, California Gold Rush in 1849. San Francisco, of course, had a huge Chinatown starting then, and Sacramento and Marysville and many other cities in California had Chinatowns until 1858. We had a big gold rush in BC on the Fraser River, and they all came up from California, Chinese and white miners and lots of others as well. And that's why Victoria's Chinatown is the oldest in Canada, because everybody came here. There was no Vancouver yet, not until the 1880s. So some people say that Victoria's Chinatown is the oldest, second oldest next to San Francisco in North America. That's not quite true either. It's the oldest in Canada, but San Francisco is definitely older, and several other Chinatowns. But in most of those places, the old buildings are gone. Victoria does have the distinction of having more old Chinatown buildings than any other city in North America.
Yeah, I would add to that because San Francisco's Chinatown was actually burned down in 1900, so Victoria's Chinatown actually has most standing surviving structures from the oldest Chinatown. So we can say it's like North America's oldest surviving Chinatown with all these from the early times.
So we had a request to see the fire insurance map again, if that's possible. John, you're
oh yeah, hang on. No, I'll do it. Read yours. Okay. Can you hear John now?
No, you're still the
okay. Okay, so you stop. I'm gonna do this.
Okay.
That's good.
Okay, we can hear now. Perfect. Okay. So we're looking north, and this is currently Pandora Avenue. This is Market Square, but this part of Market Square was part of Chinatown, the earliest part. In fact, the early Chinese farms were down here. Pandora Avenue, Fantan Alley, it continues through. Now, this was done in the early 1890s, and some of the brick buildings we saw weren't here yet. There were wooden buildings that got replaced. Out on Fiskard Street, more wooden buildings, a mixture of brick and wooden buildings, Fiskard Street, and then once Fiskard Street got built up, then Herald Street and Chatham Street, the street beyond. Chinatown extended all the way to Chatham Street, and from Store Street over here to Government Street. Government Street, in fact, was really the main street of Chinatown, and Douglas Street over here. This huge area was Chinatown. And if you look carefully, a lot of the old buildings are definitely still there. Some of them still owned and used by Chinese organizations, but many of them now used by others as well.
Thanks, John. I think you can take it out and put it back in. Put it back in? Okay, are you hearing my voice now, Chris?
We are.
Yes.
Okay, great. I just wanted to add again that if you wanted to look closely at that map, there is a copy on the Learning Portal on the Tradition and Felicities pathway. Chris, I think, has already shared the link, but then you can
I posted it on both places.
Awesome. Yeah, and thanks again, Tzu-I, for mentioning the Pocket Gallery. I forgot to mention that it's a really moving exhibit, and it is free. You can just go pop into the Pocket Gallery if you're down by the Royal BC Museum. I encourage everybody to check that out.
And I put a link for that on both Zoom and Facebook Live too.
Fantastic. So I want to thank both of my guests, but before we finish off, is there a pressing question we could try to answer in a couple minutes?
There's not a pressing question, that there was lots of comments, just especially on Facebook Live, people saying how they used to live in Victoria, and just this experience is really cool, just being able to re-experience Chinatown and Fantan Alley. So lots of appreciation. Ian does ask, are most of the second floor areas now residential?
In the first building,
yes.
John was pointing to the Taisan Mingyang building. Part of it is used as office, and the other parts are used residential. But John, you go ahead.
Sure. So there's a mixture. There are rental accommodations. There are, in fact, a few condominiums now. But more and more, as the places are being fixed up, they're being turned into condominiums. But there are some artist studios, and a couple of the upstairs places are also used for restaurants as well. And alas, there are still some that are empty, haven't been used for years. But the Chinese residential spaces have pretty well moved to other parts of the city. And there was a time when the upstairs areas in most of the Chinatown buildings were empty, but they're now being sought after by a lot of people. They want to live in Chinatown. It's a trendy thing to do.
Yeah, on the second floor of some of the stores that I visited, because they were originally designed to be to comply with the fire insurance code. Like the kind of mezzanine is very, very low, and some of them are used as still today used as storage area. So they maintain that very old dirty look. Inside, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say dirty. And so the store owners use them as storage, and then you can see where people actually living there, and there were like you can see where the kind of like wallpapers that were newspapers from the early 20th century, and there were like just traces of a cooking stove somewhere, and trapdoors as well, because they served previously as gambling dens. And so there are just like all kinds of different uses, but there are few that are closed as for people still accessing them as storage area, or just as, you know, like a triage place.
So there are two questions, and maybe I'll combine them together, two different people. Mandy asked, did the Chinese community also live in parts of Market Square? And Sherry asked, were there any quote unquote houses of ill repute in Fantan Alley?
Okay, I can perhaps answer those here.
I did read about it, the house of that, and window displays of that too. John?
Okay, so Market Square, the Pandora Avenue side of Market Square definitely was Chinatown. So that's where Li Mon Kao and his family lived. The kids that Tzu-I was showing you in that photograph were born in the space above Market Square. And it remained so until the 1970s. And houses of ill repute, yes, there were houses of ill repute all through Victoria. There were sex workers in Chinatown, there were sex workers in Old Town, and not specifically Fantan Alley. There were brothels all through Chinatown and the rest of Old Town for that matter too, especially on Johnson Street, just outside Chinatown.
I read about, yeah, like those, there were window display inside Fantan Alley of, yeah, people.
Yes.
Okay, I'll get John to take that out.
Now you should be able, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Great. Okay, thank you. I just want to say again, thank you to Tzu-I Chung and John Adams for bringing the history of this teeny little dense place. It's so tiny, but it's just dense with history. And thank you for bringing it alive for us today. The recording will be up on YouTube pretty soon. And I hope you'll join me in a couple of weeks at Point Ellis House. And thank you everybody for joining, and thanks for your comments and your questions. And I'll sign off. Thanks very much. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
John.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.